December 4th, 1991. A Pan Am jet touches down and taxis to the gate for the last time. Inside, flight attendants who have worn the blue wings for 20-30 years are crying openly in the aisles. There will be no more Pan Am flights after this one. No more clippers. No more blue globe on the tail cutting through clouds over oceans it once had almost entirely to itself. 64 years of history end on a runway, quietly, without ceremony. How does the airline that invented international air travel, that put the first 747 into the sky, that was for decades the closest thing America had to a flag carrier, simply run out of runway? To understand how it all fell apart, you have to go back to the beginning, to one hired seaplane and a bag of mail. On October 19, 1927, a hired Fairchild float plane lifted off from Key West, Florida, carrying sacks of mail bound for Havana, Cuba. It wasn't glamorous. It was a contract flight, chasing a postal subsidy before a rival could claim the route first. But the man behind it, a young, relentless former Navy pilot named Juan Trippe, did not think of it as a mail run. He thought of it as the first flight of an airline that would belong to the world. Trippe had a gift most airline executives of his era lacked. He understood that aviation was geopolitics with wings. Where the U.S. Navy and State Department wanted American influence extended into Latin America and across the Pacific and Atlantic, Pan Am was there to provide it, one negotiated landing right at a time. Washington needed an unofficial flag carrier that could project American reach without an American flag on the tail fin, and Trippe built exactly that. Within a decade, Pan Am held route rights that no domestic competitor could touch, because no domestic competitor had any interest in flying to them. Then came the Clippers. Pan Am's flying boats, built by Sikorsky and later the enormous Boeing 314s, could land on water, which meant they didn't need runways abroad, which meant they could go almost anywhere there was a harbor. The China Clippers' flight across the Pacific in 1935 wasn't just a technical feat, it was a statement. An American airline could now stitch together San Francisco and Manila, oceans that had never been bridged by scheduled air travel. Newspapers covered Pan Am's flights the way they covered polar expeditions. Trippe understood the theater of it and used it relentlessly. Pan Am kept setting the pace. It helped pioneer cabin pressurization with the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, letting passengers fly above the weather instead of through it. It became the launch customer for the Boeing 707, hauling the world into the jet age and shrinking the Atlantic crossing from a day to a matter of hours. And in January 1970, a Pan Am 747 took off on the airline's New York to London route, opening the era of the jumbo jet. Pan Am hadn't just bought the first 747. It had gone to Boeing years earlier and pushed the company to build it in the first place, betting the future of intercontinental travel on Trippe's conviction that bigger planes meant a bigger world. By the late 1960s, the Pan Am Globe logo was arguably more recognizable overseas than the American flag itself. Its terminal at JFK, the Pan Am building looming over Manhattan, its ads promising the whole planet within reach. This was an airline that had, quite literally, no domestic peer, because it had almost no domestic business at all. It was purely, deliberately, an airline for the world. For 50 years, that had been its superpower. Nobody yet suspected it would become the reason everything came apart. For 50 years, Pan Am's greatest strength was that the United States government decided who could fly where internationally, and Pan Am usually got the routes. It never needed a domestic network, because domestic flying wasn't the business it was in. Passengers connected to Pan Am's global flights through other carriers, through trains, through however they got to New York or Miami. That was fine, as long as the rules of the game stayed the same. They didn't. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 tore up decades of route protection and let American carriers compete freely at home and, increasingly, abroad. On the surface, this looked like it should have helped Pan Am, freeing it from bureaucratic route allocation. In practice, it did the opposite. Airlines like United and American had something Pan Am never built: sprawling domestic networks that fed passengers from dozens of American cities directly onto their own international flights. A traveler in Ohio could now fly one airline all the way to London. Pan Am could only get that traveler once they'd already reached a coastal gateway city, and only if a partner airline handed them over. Deregulation didn't just open competition in the sky Pan Am already ruled. It let rivals build a driveway straight into that sky, one Pan Am had no equivalent of at home. The fix seemed obvious: buy a domestic airline. In 1980, after a bidding war against Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation, Pan Am acquired National Airlines, a Miami-based domestic carrier with an easy, informal Southern culture that had almost nothing in common with Pan Am's buttoned-up, internationally minded management. The price was steep, won largely by simply outbidding a determined rival, and the debt load that came with it would hang over Pan Am for the rest of its existence. Worse, the acquisition never solved the underlying problem. National's route map and Pan Am's route map barely overlapped in useful ways. Integrating the fleets, the labor contracts, and the cultures turned into a drawn-out headache instead of the seamless global-to-domestic pipeline Pan Am needed. The company had spent enormous sums to buy feed for its international flights and ended up with a bolted-on domestic airline that fed very little and cost a great deal. To service the debt, Pan Am started doing something no one inside the company wanted to say out loud: selling the assets that made it Pan Am in the first place. In 1981, it sold the Pan Am building, the Manhattan skyscraper that had been a physical monument to its dominance, right there above Grand Central. It was a rational cash decision and an unmistakable signal, a company liquidating its own symbolism to keep flying. Executives told themselves this was temporary, a bridge to stability. Nobody yet believed the bridge led nowhere. The routes and buildings that had made Pan Am synonymous with global travel were, one by one, becoming collateral for a debt problem that refused to shrink. By the mid-1980s, Pan Am was a company selling itself to survive piece by piece. In 1985, it sold its Pacific routes, the very network the China Clipper had pioneered 50 years earlier, to United Airlines. It was a staggering admission. The airline that opened the Pacific to commercial flight no longer had the capital to fly it. Not long after, Pan Am sold off most of its prized Heathrow routes to United as well, surrendering its position in one of the most valuable aviation markets on Earth. Each sale bought time. Each sale also shrank the only thing that had ever made Pan Am indispensable: the size and reach of its global network. The company was eating itself to stay alive, and every meal made it smaller. Then, on December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 left London Heathrow bound for New York. Over Lockerbie, Scotland, a bomb concealed in the cargo hold detonated, tearing the aircraft apart mid-flight and killing 270 people on board and on the ground. It was an act of terrorism, not a business failure, but its consequences for Pan Am were existential. Investigations exposed security failures. Lawsuits followed. Travelers who once saw the Pan Am globe as a promise of safe passage across oceans now saw it as a target. Bookings fell. Confidence, the one asset Pan Am had never had to sell off, collapsed almost overnight. The airline limped into the new decade with a network that was a shadow of what it had been, a debt load it had never escaped, and a reputation wound that would not close. In January 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy protection. Executives still hoped for a restructuring, a buyer, some combination of asset sales and fresh financing that could keep the wings in the air. Delta Airlines stepped in with an investment and took over some of Pan Am's remaining transatlantic routes and operations. But it was a partial rescue, not a resurrection. It kept fragments of the airline flying under Pan Am's name for a few more months, not the airline itself. On December 4, 1991, with cash exhausted and no further lifeline coming, Pan Am ceased all operations. The final flight landed, and 64 years after a hired float plane carried mail to Havana, there was no Pan Am left to carry anything at all. The globe that had once seemed to promise the whole world had run out of places left to sell. Delta Airlines absorbed what was left of Pan Am's roots and some of its people, folding pieces of a global pioneer into just another network. The Pan Am name would resurface over the following years on smaller ventures, trying to borrow its glamour, none of them lasting, none of them the airline that once put the first jumbo jet into the sky. Juan Tripe himself had died in 1981, before he saw the deepest cuts and the final bankruptcy, spared the sight of the globe grounded for good. What's left now is mostly memory. The blue and white livery on museum-piece aircraft, the Pan Am building in Manhattan still standing under a different name, old ticket jackets and matchbooks traded by collectors who remember what the logo used to mean. For decades, that logo had been shorthand for American reach and modern glamour, stamped on the tail fins of the planes that first crossed the Pacific and first carried passengers on a 747. It is strange to think that an airline this dominant died not from a single knockout blow, but from the compounding weight of a law it couldn't adapt to, a merger it couldn't digest, and a tragedy it couldn't survive. The uncomfortable lesson isn't really about airlines. It's about what happens when the rules that built your advantage change and you keep playing by the old ones anyway. Pan Am owned the sky over every ocean on Earth and never built the roads that led travelers to it at home. When those roads suddenly mattered more than the ocean crossings themselves, there was no fixing it with money borrowed against a building or a route network, sold off route by route. By the time Lockerbie delivered its blow, Pan Am had almost nothing left to absorb it. The airline that connected the world, in the end, couldn't connect itself to the one market it had always ignored, its own country. It flew everywhere except home, until one December evening in 1991, home was the only place left to land.